Hi, I thought I would try doing a rough draft for Shabbat. I was asked by my rabbi to give the drasha this week, so that's kind of, I guess, similar to a homily, because he'll be away. So I thought maybe I'd try this format. So since the rabbi isn't here, I thought you'd take this. I thought I'd take this opportunity to ask you all something. What is the job of a rabbi? The answer is in this week's Torah portion. So, is it to lead us on a spiritual journey? It's an excellent idea, sure. Is it to field complaints like the daughters of Tzlefchad's uncles when people don't like God's rulings? It definitely comes with the territory. Maybe it's to provide refuge when we accidentally murder someone. Well, you'll have to ask the rabbi's family how they feel about that when they get back. But I want to argue that one of the primary jobs of the rabbi, according to our rabbis, is Hatarat Nedarim, the annulment of vows. The most drashot on this part of the parsha take one of two paths. They either talk about the power of our words to create realities, or they focus on the annulment of women's vows and grapple with patriarchal norms within our tradition. While both these topics bear some scrutiny, I'd like to suggest that neither gets to the heart of the matter. In fact, the Torah Shabbat Peh explains that a man's ability to annul a woman within his household's vows is in fact very, very limited. He can only annul a vow if it directly affects an aspect of their relationship and only within 24 hours of hearing that vow. But as much as the Torah Shabbat Peh limits the power of the father and husband, it expands it from an unexpected direction by asking about the first line of our parsha, about something in its very name. Of all of God's commandments, why is this the only one Moshe mentions the Roshei Hamatot, the tribal leaders? Rabbis explain that this is because Moshe was highlighting the leaders' special responsibility. Essentially, they would become the fathers of their entire tribe. This isn't just an asmachta, though. One of the only other times Moshe addresses the heads of the tribes is towards the end of our parsha, when he calls them to witness the vow he makes Reuven and Gad take that their men will fight the head of the other tribes to conquer Canaan in return for their lands east of the Jordan. When any member of their tribe would need a vow annulled, they would come to their leaders. Therefore, these leaders needed to be experts in the laws of vows. So what are these laws? Vows do indeed create binding realities, and we care deeply about integrity and keeping them. The rabbis warn us, based on a line from Ecclesiastes, it is better to not vow at all than to make a vow to God and then break it. Yet sometimes we create realities we regret. Most famously, Yiftach, who is initially described as a man of words, whose name is understood to mean one who opens his mouth, is caught in his own horrific vow to sacrifice his daughter. Words turned into unsmashable idols. But why didn't Yiftach have the Gadol Hador, the greatest sage of his generation, Pinchas, who is the high priest? Why didn't he ask him to have it annulled? The Midrash says this is because he was too proud. He was too proud to lose face, and more importantly, too proud to not keep his word. But if he had gone to Pinchas, how could Pinchas have helped? Well, there are three ways a vow can be annulled. The first is on a technicality. A vow premised on a misidentified person or object. That vow doesn't even need an expert to undo. The second is an expansion of a mistaken vow. This is a vow that has potentially unanticipated logical consequences. The role of the leader here is to help the vow taker find an opening by helping to clarify their priorities. Would you have vowed to sacrifice the first thing coming out of your house if you considered it could be your daughter? Now, the third method of annulment is emotional. This is an annulment that we call it coming from regret. Vows are often taken in the heat of emotion, but when emotions change, so can the weights we give our priorities. The leader here is not there to apply their logic and legal expertise to the vow, but their emotional expertise as the tribal father. This sheds light on one of the most enigmatic parts of our parsha. Why does the high priest's death allow negligent murderers to leave their cities of refuge? The Kohen Gadol, the high priest, is responsible for the education of the nation, the justice system, and assuring its institutions have appropriate safeguards. Suppose one person kills another due to negligence. In that case, it's not only their negligence, but also the high priest's. The Midrash says that the high priest's mother would go to the cities of refuge, and they would bring them people their food and gifts, so they wouldn't pray for their son's death. The mothers seek to change their mind, regret their prayers, rebuild a relationship between the high priest and the people, but in some way he has failed. Thus, the rabbis don't only point to Yiftach, but Pinchas too, as having failed each other, and ultimately Yiftach's daughter. In the book of Esther, we find yet another woman called upon to annul a vow, surprisingly. In Esther 4:14, Mordechai tells Esther, "For if you keep silent at this moment, relief and deliverance will come to the Jews from elsewhere, and you and your father's house will perish." But the language of silence, hacharesh tacharishi, is a very rare turn of phrase and is used in our parsha here for the husband or father who is silent when he hears his daughter or wife's vow, v'hacharesh la, and is silent for her. The pasuk in Esther, the verse, also stresses the importance of acting in the moment and Esther's responsibility for the survival of her father's household. Mordechai stresses that only she can annul Haman's vow to destroy the empire's Jews. Similarly, every day, multiple times a day, we quote and paraphrase verses that Hashem is Hefir Eitzah of our enemies, that he annuls the advice or counsel of our enemies. This isn't just a call to cancel them unilaterally. If we have enemies, it's often due to our own negligence in our own actions. Whether emotionally or rationally, as a nation of priests, we have failed, must take responsibility and find ways of undoing their enmity. The paradigm of this comes from the most surprising place, Exodus 32:11, where we begin the reading every fast day. V'yechal Moshe pnei Hashem Elokav. Usually it's just translated as Moses davening to God in the wake of the golden calf incident. But the Midrash picks up on the word yachel, used in our parsha to mean to not make one's word empty or to cancel one's word, lo yachel devaro. In the Midrash, which is quoted in the Talmud Bavli Brachot 32a, Rava says Moshe annulled God's vow to destroy us. The Midrash expands on this. Moshe said to God, "You taught us that a person cannot annul their own vows, but let me help you find where you spoke too hastily. I will find an opening to annul your vow, a place where your mercy and compassion move you to regret." In this startling Midrash, even the all-powerful God uses the perspective of another to challenge him. Vows can create realities. They are the basis of an ideal you imagine, a land on the east bank of the Jordan for your family, giving God the most you can, even a better nation than the one that currently exists. There's a real power to committing to make those visions real, but sometimes those personal utopic visions are dangerous. We become too enamored of our own dreams, and we need an outsider's perspective and feedback. Today we finish the book of Bamidbar. As the rabbis teach, one must make oneself like a midbar, a desert, in order to receive the Torah. To empty ourselves like a desert in order to hear God. But another creative reading goes further, noting that man is called the midaber, which is spelled the same way as midbar. Midaber means the speaker. To receive the Torah, we must learn to speak. Even in the desert, there's always someone listening. There is no vow that doesn't have an effect beyond us, whether it be our spouse or parent or even our leaders. On those leaders, above all, must make themselves like the desert, to empty themselves properly, to hear the other, their vision and their ideals, and their priorities, to try to understand what they're coming from and how to help them understand their own priorities, to have an even deeper integrity, not just to their words, but to their values. The true job of a Jewish religious leader, from queens to Kohanei Gadol to rabbis, doesn't just require knowledge of halacha, but extensive practice with critical thinking, emotional processing, strong social bonds, and a distinct sense of social responsibility. We are about to enter the 9 days, and this week's Daf Yomi happens to have covered stories leading up to the Second Temple's destruction in Gittin. In time and again, both ancient and modern rabbis place the blame on the rabbis for their failures at that moment in time. Yes, the host in the story about Kamsa is wrong. Yes, the rich and the zealots and the Sakurai all were involved in the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. But the people who get the hardest look in the rabbinic texts are the rabbis. For not being sensitive to the distress around them, for being too hung up on technicalities to see the bigger picture, for trying to realize a halachic ideal world when the real world around them was collapsing. Through the Torah Shabbal Peh, we witness the rabbis grappling with a long tradition of hard-won accumulated wisdom on how to be ideal leaders of our people. My friend pointed out that we see such a model in last week's Haftarah, the first for the 3 weeks, going all the way back to Jeremiah. At the start of his career as a prophet, decrying the nation's behavior, which will lead to the destruction of the first temple, he starts off first with surprisingly tender words. Kol Mar Hashem, Zacharti lach chesed no'orayich avat kilulotayich tachtech acharai b'midbar be'eretz lo zerah. Thus said Hashem, I'll remind you of the kindness of your youth, the love which completely adorned you. You follow me in the midbar, in lands unsown. Even in rebuke, true and effective leadership stems from the loving relationship that first took root when each person made themselves like a midbar. The one getting feedback and even being rebuked, whether doing teshuvah or annulling their vow, must feel that they are known, seen, heard, and loved. A final law of vows. When such a leader isn't around, like this weekend, the law is that 3 regular people can take their place. This isn't just a message for our rabbis. We too are called to be responsible, as family members and community members. Like Esther, we cannot be silent in moments of need or distress. We too cannot be negligent, for we are also responsible. Likewise, when the rabbi isn't around, remember, you always have your community. Take it from a non-rabbi. When you hear the voice of regret echoing from the wilderness, it may be time to gather 3 friends. Let them help you gain perspective. Empty yourself so you can truly hear their feedback. And during these 3 weeks, may we all be zocha to glean clarity on our priorities and achieve the true integrity of our values. Shabbat shalom.